The morning of August 6, 1945, began like any other in Hiroshima. The cicadas were loud, the air was already warm, and mothers were urging their children out the door to school. Farmers were tending to their rice paddies just beyond the city. Shopkeepers opened shutters, and office workers adjusted their ties before heading off to work. Nothing in those quiet, simple moments hinted that within minutes, a new kind of dawn was about to rise, one brighter than the sun and far deadlier. At 8:15 a.m., a blinding flash tore across the sky. The city, an ordinary, living city, ceased to exist. That's how it began. And before we dive into what followed, if you love real history, the kind that isn't just dates and generals but flesh and blood humanity, subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button and share this story with someone who thinks they already know what happened at Hiroshima. Because trust me, they don't. Alright, let's go back to the beginning. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki isn't just about the bombs. It's about people. It's about choices made in rooms filled with cigar smoke and fear. It's about scientists who dreamed of changing the world and then realized, too late, what they'd unleashed. It's about a generation that looked into the heart of something divine and terrible and had to live with what they saw. In the summer of 1945, the world was weary. 6 years of total war had ground humanity down to the bone. Europe was rubble. The Pacific burned. Japan had lost its navy, its air force, its colonies. Yet still it fought on. Cities were firebombed night after night. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, all reduced to ash. The war should have ended, but it didn't. In Washington and Los Alamos, scientists and generals were racing towards something unimaginable. The Manhattan Project, thousands of people working in secrecy, had turned theory into weapon. They'd split the atom, unleashed energy measured in suns, and built two devices unlike anything before or since. One was called Little Boy, a uranium bomb, crude but deadly. The other, Fat Man, used plutonium, a far more complex design. Only a handful of men truly understood what these weapons could do. The rest could only guess. There's a letter, declassified years later, from General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, describing the first test at Alamogordo, New Mexico. He wrote, "The explosion produced a light many times brighter than the sun. It was as though we had turned the key in the door to a new era." Robert Oppenheimer, watching the same fireball rise, quoted a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But on the morning of August 6th, it wasn't myth or poetry. It was orders. Colonel Paul Tibbets climbed into his B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, named after his mother. The plane gleamed under the early light at Tinian Island, loaded with one bomb weighing over 9,000 pounds. It was unlike any mission ever flown. Every man aboard knew it. Before takeoff, Tibbets told them, "We're about to bring this war to a close." No one really understood what that meant. As the Enola Gay approached Hiroshima, the city below was calm. Radar detected no enemy planes, so the air raid sirens had stopped. Housewives were sweeping porches. School children were practicing calisthenics in the yard. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. The crew heard the steady voice of the bombardier. "Bomb away." 43 seconds later, the sky ripped apart. The bomb detonated 600 meters above the city, releasing energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at ground zero reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. In an instant, 70,000 people vanished, burned, vaporized, or buried beneath collapsing buildings. The blast wave flattened everything within 2 miles. Glass melted. Shadows were burned into walls. Rivers boiled. But what's often forgotten is that the pilots didn't see the horror below. They felt the shock wave even miles away, saw the mushroom cloud rising, and one of them, Captain Robert Lewis, wrote in his log, "My God, what have we done?" Down below, survivors wandered through the ruins like ghosts. They had no idea what had happened. A young woman named Michiko Hattori described walking through the streets, seeing people whose skin hung in tatters, their faces unrecognizable. "They didn't scream," she said later, "they just stared." It was too much for the mind to understand. Hospitals were gone. Water was gone. Fire was everywhere. Those who could move searched for their families, calling names into the smoke. And amid it all, a black rain began to fall, radioactive ash mixed with soot and dust, covering the survivors as they stumbled toward the outskirts. In Tokyo, the government initially refused to believe it was an atomic bomb. No one could comprehend that such a weapon existed. They sent scientists to investigate. Within hours, their clothes were contaminated. They returned stunned, unable to speak. Meanwhile, in the United States, headlines read, "A single bomb destroys an entire city." People cheered. The war was ending. The terrible arithmetic of the Pacific, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, the thought of a mainland invasion costing millions of lives, seemed to justify it. That's how leaders framed it. One bomb to save 1,000,000 lives. But history rarely fits so neatly into moral boxes. Because even as Hiroshima smoldered, another bomb was being prepared. President Truman, at the time aboard the cruiser Augusta, released a statement. "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." He meant it. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. But before we go there, if you've made it this far, thank you. This isn't easy history to listen to, I know, but it matters. If you're the kind of person who believes stories like these need to be remembered, not glorified, but understood, please subscribe. It helps more than you can imagine. Hit the like button, leave a comment about how this story makes you feel, and share it with someone who thinks war is just about victory and defeat. It's never that simple. Now, let's fly toward Nagasaki. The morning of August 6, 1945, was quiet in Hiroshima. Children were walking to school, workers were sweeping the streets, and mothers were preparing rice for breakfast. The air was clear, almost unnaturally calm. The previous nights had been full of air raid sirens, but nothing had fallen here. People were beginning to believe that Hiroshima had been spared. Some said it was because the city was too beautiful to bomb. Others whispered that the Americans were saving it for something special. They were right, though they couldn't have imagined how terribly right they were. At 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay appeared in the sky. Its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had trained for months for this exact moment. The bomb in his aircraft was called Little Boy, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the bomb bay, it rested quietly, 10,000 pounds of metal and uranium, waiting for gravity to do its part. As the plane reached the release point, Tibbets took a deep breath, adjusted his controls, and released the bomb. It fell for 43 seconds. Just enough time for people below to look up, to wonder what that silver speck in the sky was. Some children pointed at it. Others kept walking. Then, light.
A flash brighter than the sun itself.
For an instant, the entire city became pure white.
Then came the sacave.
Buildings vanished. Streets melted. The sound followed, rolling through the air like the end of the world. The center of Hiroshima ceased to exist. Temperatures near the epicenter soared above 4,000 degrees Celsius. Human shadows were seared into walls. Bodies turned to vapor. Within seconds, tens of thousands were gone. And those who survived the blast, those in the outer edges, suffered burns that no one knew how to treat. Skin hung in strips, eyes blinded by the flash. The riverbanks filled with people stumbling, screaming, calling for water. Many stepped into the rivers and never came out. In the cockpit of the Enola Gay, Tibbets and his crew saw the shockwave rising like a living thing. A great cloud boiling upwards, twisting with colors of brown, red, and gray. They felt the concussion even from miles away. The men were silent. Co-pilot Robert Lewis finally said, "My God, what have we done?" There was no answer. Back in Washington, the news spread fast. President Truman was aboard the USS Augusta returning from the Potsdam Conference when the message arrived, results clear-cut success. Truman's face lit up. He believed it meant the war could now end without a bloody invasion of Japan. He didn't yet know the true scale of what success meant on the ground. In Hiroshima, survivors crawled through ruins that still burned. Doctors who hadn't been vaporized rushed to help the wounded, but there was no medicine, no water, no electricity. The hospitals had collapsed. One nurse described the city as a sea of fire and death. That night, strange black rain began to fall, heavy, oily drops that carried radioactive ash. People were so desperate for water that they drank it. They didn't know it was poisoned. And in the midst of it all, something remarkable happened. The human spirit, the stubborn will to survive, kept flickering. Mothers searched for children. Soldiers cleared rubble with bare hands. Priests gave last rites among the dying. Some people began to write, to draw, to record what they saw. They didn't know the word radiation yet. They only knew pain, and that they wanted the world to understand it. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American military planners were already preparing the second strike. Not out of cruelty, but calculation. They believed Japan's leaders still hadn't surrendered because they refused to accept defeat. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The very next day, another B-29 took off, this time carrying a bomb named Fat Man. Its target was Kokura, but heavy clouds forced the crew to divert. The alternate target was Nagasaki. As the plane approached, Nagasaki was hidden under thick clouds. The bombardier, Major Charles Sweeney, almost turned back. But at the last moment, a small opening appeared. Through that gap, the bomb was released. It fell into a valley dense with homes, factories, and a cathedral filled with worshippers. The explosion was even stronger than Hiroshima's. The valley trapped the blast, amplifying its destruction. By nightfall, Nagasaki was gone. Over 40,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more would die from burns and radiation. One survivor, a schoolgirl, remembered seeing her friends with skin peeled off like wet paper. Another man described the silence that followed. No birds, no sound, just wind moving through the ashes. The Japanese government was stunned. Within days, Emperor Hirohito broke centuries of tradition and spoke directly to the people. His voice, trembling, came through the radio. "We must endure the unendurable." It was his way of saying Japan would surrender. The war was over. But for the survivors, the war never really ended. They became known as Hibakusha, the bomb-affected people. Many were shunned, seen as cursed or contaminated. The radiation sickness brought slow, mysterious deaths. Hair falling out, bleeding gums, fevers that wouldn't end. And yet, those who lived carried on with incredible dignity. Some rebuilt homes, others started schools. Many told their stories so no one would forget. There's one story that stands out. A young doctor named Shuntaro Hida. He was only 28 when the bomb hit Hiroshima. Instead of running, he spent days treating survivors with whatever he could find. Years later, he traveled the world, showing photos, giving lectures, trying to make people understand not just the science of the bomb, but its human toll. They were people, he said, not statistics. And that's the thing we sometimes forget. Behind every historical event, every military decision, there are people. Ordinary people who wake up one morning and never know they're about to become part of history. Before we continue, if this story moves you, even a little, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more forgotten human stories like this back to life. Like the video, share it with someone who believes history isn't just about dates and generals, but about hearts and choices. Alright, back to 1945. In the weeks after Japan's surrender, American teams entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki to study the damage. They brought cameras, notebooks, Geiger counters. They walked through landscapes that didn't look real. Buildings melted into glass, bridges twisted like ribbons. Yet amid the ruins, flowers were blooming. Within a month, green shoots were pushing through the ashes. Nature, it seemed, refused to die. Japanese doctors began documenting what they called A-bomb disease. They didn't yet know it was radiation poisoning. People who had seemed fine began to sicken. Their white blood cell counts dropped. Some bled from gums or ears. Many died without visible wounds. The Americans studying them were equally puzzled. They realized they had unleashed something they barely understood. General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, once said he never lost a night's sleep over the bomb. But many scientists did. Men like Robert Oppenheimer, who had watched the first atomic test in the New Mexico desert and whispered a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer visited President Truman and told him he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman angrily dismissed him, saying he'd never want to see that man again. Two men, one burdened by guilt, the other by responsibility, staring into a moral chasm that still divides opinion today. The bomb had ended the war, yes, but it had also begun something else, a new kind of fear. Humanity had split the atom, and in doing so, split its conscience. When the smoke cleared and the fires finally died out, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became something between a wound and a warning. The ruins stood silent, but the silence said more than speeches ever could. Those who walked among them said the air itself seemed heavy with memory. Nothing smelled quite right. Even the wind felt different, as if it carried whispers of the people who had been there only hours before the flash. In the months after the bombings, the cities became strange laboratories of life and death. American occupation forces arrived with cameras and scientists, curious and cautious, documenting everything. The shadows burned into steps, the bones of buildings, the patterns of destruction. They took soil samples, measured radiation, counted survivors. To them, it was a study in physics and warfare. To the Japanese, it was a cemetery. Every brick, every street corner, was a grave. The survivors, those who could still walk, began to call themselves Hibakusha, not as a title of pride, but of truth. The word carried both pain and defiance. Many of them were children when it happened. Some lost their entire families. Some were left with keloid scars, twisted, pink tissue that never stopped aching. Others carried invisible wounds, radiation sickness that returned again and again, years after the fires had gone cold. Doctors tried to help, but medicine had never seen anything like this. Some people would suddenly bleed from their gums or nose. Others' hair fell out in clumps. Pregnant women miscarried without warning. A mother named Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old when the bomb hit Hiroshima. She survived the blast and grew into a healthy, cheerful girl. But a decade later, she developed leukemia, a slow, quiet echo of that morning. Lying in a hospital bed, she began folding paper cranes. Her wish was simple: to live. She made more than 1,000 before she died, at 12 years old. Her cranes became symbols of peace all over the world. But not everyone looked at the Hibakusha with sympathy. Some employers refused to hire them. Some families wouldn't let their children marry them, fearing they carried a taint. Survivors learned to hide their identities. They bore their suffering quietly, a private pain in a nation that wanted to rebuild, not remember. And rebuild it did. The American occupation turned Hiroshima into a kind of paradox, a living city built on a dead one. New roads, new buildings, a peace memorial park where the bomb had fallen. The Genbaku Dome, the last standing structure near Ground Zero, was left untouched, its skeleton frame rising against the sky as a witness that would never speak but never look away. 4 years. The bombings were wrapped in silence. Japan was censored during the occupation. Photos and films of the destruction were confiscated. It wasn't until years later that the world began to see what had really happened. Burned faces, charred schools, streets full of the dead. The kind of images that no one forgets once they've seen them. The pilots, too, lived with their memories. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had flown Enola Gay, remained steadfast all his life that he'd done what was necessary. "I sleep fine," he used to say. But others from the crews spoke of quiet guilt. Co-pilot Robert Lewis, the man who had written, "My God, what have we done?" later said he was haunted by those words. In the years that followed, the debate grew louder. Was it justified? Did the bombs save more lives than they took? Historians still argue about it, even today. Some say it ended the war quickly, sparing millions who might have died in an invasion of Japan. Others say Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the bombs were meant more as a message to the Soviets than a necessity.
더 트루스, 에즈 오레이즈, 라이브즈 서메어 인빗.
What can't be debated, though, is the human cost. The smell of burnt hair. The cries of children calling for mothers who'd already turned to ash. The loneliness of those who survived only to spend the rest of their lives explaining why they lived when others didn't.
이어즈 애프터 더 오어, 어메리컨 사이언티스트 헤럴드 에그누. 후 플루 인 더 어컴퍼니잉 아브저베이션 플레인, 비지티드 히로시마 어겐.
Locals recognized him, and some confronted him with quiet anger. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, looking at the Peace Park where the bomb had fallen. "It's strange," he said softly.
It's all so clean now.
And maybe that's the hardest part to accept, that the world moved on. That people walked again on the same ground where shadows once burned into stone. Children laughed where people once screamed. Cities healed, but the wounds stayed in our collective memory, like a scar we pretend not to notice but always feel when the light hits it just right. Before we move on, take a second. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told with honesty and heart, hit subscribe. It tells me you care about the people behind history, not just the headlines. Share this video with someone who still believes peace is worth fighting for.
Alright, let's finish this story.
The Cold War turned the lessons of Hiroshima into new terrors. The very scientists who had built the first bomb now race to build bigger ones.
하이드로전 밤즈.
Warheads capable of vaporizing entire cities in seconds. Oppenheimer became an advocate for restraint, but he was stripped of his security clearance, exiled from the machine he'd helped create. He once said, "The physicists have known sin." And in that sentence, he captured the weight that all humanity suddenly shared. Meanwhile, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols, not of defeat, but of rebirth. The people rebuilt their lives, their homes, their spirits. The peace bell rings every year on August 6th and 9th.
스쿨 칠드런 리사이 세대 코즈 스토리. 페이퍼 크레인즈 필 뮤지엄즈.
And every year, survivors tell their stories again, even as their voices grow fewer.
They speak softly, without bitterness.
They don't ask for vengeance. They ask for memory. In the 1950s, when the U.S. was testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific, one Hiroshima survivor said, "If the world forgets Hiroshima, it will happen again." It wasn't prophecy, it was warning. A warning that feels uncomfortably alive even now. I once read a story about an old man in Hiroshima. He'd lost everything, his family, his home, his health. And yet, every morning, he would sweep the path in front of the Peace Memorial Park. When asked why, he said, "Because the dead deserve a clean road to heaven." That kind of quiet dignity is what defines the Hibakusha. They suffered more than most of us can imagine, yet they never stopped teaching the world what it means to be human. In Nagasaki, near the rebuilt Urakami Cathedral, a single burned wooden cross still stands. It's blackened, twisted, but unbroken. Around it, children play, laughter echoing off new walls.
The past and the future, side by side.
In the end, the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki isn't just about bombs or politics or science. It's about choice. The choices that led to those moments, and the choices we keep making since, to remember or to forget, to destroy or to protect, to hate or to heal. If you've made it this far, take a deep breath. Look around. The fact that we can talk about this, that we can think about it, means we're still capable of empathy, and that's worth holding on to. So before this story closes, one last thing. If you believe the world needs more reminders of our shared humanity, subscribe, like, and share this video. Not for me, but for the memory of the people who can no longer speak for themselves. When night falls over Hiroshima now, the city glows with quiet lights. Lanterns drift along the Motoyasu River, each one carrying a name, a memory, a prayer. They float past the dome, past the bridges, toward the sea. No speeches, no anger, just light moving through darkness. That's the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not the weapon, not the war, but the people who rose again from the ashes, teaching the world, silently, what mercy looks like after hell.